Okay, thanks everyone. The Bruno told me I was a little bit too hasty earlier, so we had an extra 5 minutes. We have a more relaxed schedule today. I'll reintroduce myself again. My name is Zach Edwards from Global Labour Justice. Bruno kindly asked me to facilitate today. I'm told we have a easier, more relaxed, not so time-sensitive day, so I'm glad I had that instead of the first two. I've also been asked to give my reflections on yesterday before we start today. So, for me, yesterday was really insightful. I split it into two main themes. I think we really got a great overview of the global challenges facing workers and impeding the welfare of workers. We heard about the challenges of climate change, how this is going to exacerbate labour rights issues on fishing vessels. We heard about the barriers, and the data barriers in particular for occupational health and safety, and where governments need to go to improve this. And we also heard about the barriers on monitoring, control and surveillance, and where governments need to go to improve compliance and improve the situation out on the water for workers. And the other thing that came across really clear, I think everyone would agree, was we got a great oversight from organisations, unions and workers on the front lines facing these issues and having to deal with them day to day. We heard about the scale of their challenges, but for me, I think it was more inspiring to hear about the great work people are doing in addressing these challenges and putting systems and programs in place that empower workers to protect their own rights, which I think is key. And then we had Hadi close the ceremony for us, who had pointed out correctly the day before that he was the only migrant fisher in attendance at the Conference for Fishers' Welfare. And I think he aptly described, in his context, the distant water Taiwanese fishing context, how Wi-Fi, is the key enabling factor for workers in that situation to protect their own rights. And it's been great to see that recognised throughout the conference in the context of Taiwan. So, our first speaker today is Dr. Jason Zuidema. He is the Executive Director for the North American Maritime Ministry Association and General Secretary of the International Christian Maritime Association. The goals of both organisations include professional development and networking for its members, but also providing a common voice for seafarers and fishers' welfare to increase collaboration with ports, government, labour and the wider maritime industry. Dr. Zuidema has been involved in seafarers' welfare since 1997 and previously taught at Montreal's Foley University. Currently, he also serves as the Vice Chair for the Canadian National Seafarers' Welfare Board, is a trustee of ISWAN, and is the producer of the Ship Welfare Visitor Course online for the UK Merchant Navy Welfare Board. Dr. Zuidema lives in Montreal with his wife and 3 children. Please, welcome Jason to the stage.
Brothers and sisters, today I want to tell you a story. It's the story of care of fishers in one particular port, my country, Canada, St. John's, Newfoundland. The story has several chapters, each one that can help us understand how to minister to the people of the sea in interreligious and in intercultural environment. Chapter 1. In 1893, Abbé Théodore Garnier and his confraternity of Notre Dame de la Mer opened up foyers or clubs at various points along the French coast to serve French fishers. This group came to be known as the Société Œuvre de Mer, or SOM, the Society for Works of the Sea. And in 1900, the SOM decided to use an anonymous gift of 75,000 francs, a big gift, to build the St. Francis of Assisi boat, a vessel equipped with sail and also an auxiliary engine. Though it was fiercely expensive to run, it was altered in 1901 and served as the sole mission vessel for 11 years. And that mission was especially aimed at serving fishers across the Atlantic that fished off the coast of Newfoundland, then at that time still an autonomous territory under the control of the United Kingdom, but with some claims by France. Among the projects of this mission, the Société Œuvre de Mer, was the newspaper La Croix des Marins, the Mariner's Cross, which focused on French fishers' rights and advocacy, and this newspaper ran from 1894 to 1914. On May 5th, 1901, for example, the newspaper reported in its pages that day the sinking of 6 ships. This was no exception, but was the rule. In each of the editions, numerous ships were reported sunk. On this particular day, there was 6 ships sunk, with the result of more than 20 fishers dead. One such incident involved the Psyche, a ship that had 19 crew members. Of the 19 crew members, after the ship went down, 10 fishers drowned, 3 died of hunger. The remaining 6 were finally rescued by a Norwegian trawler. They had been drifting for 40 days, and between the 6 fishers, had 48 biscuits to eat between them for those 40 days. This was the kind of story that regularly ran in this newspaper, La Croix des Marins. And reading this newspaper is strangely familiar for us, though it shouldn't be. It's amazing that the issues that were running in this newspaper in the year 1901 are very similar to those that we still face today. Safety, danger, and all the challenges of life at sea for fishers. This Société Œuvre de la Mer had a particular focus on the French fleet in the territory off Newfoundland. And at that time, that territory was still a long way from its integration into modern Canada. That only happened in 1949. The French still believed they had a claim on it, and that the future of the territory was frequently front-page news for seafarer, for fishers, in this newspaper. And as you might know, just beside Newfoundland, there still are French overseas territories, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. In addition to the newspaper, over many years, the Society ran this ship, and then a series after that, Notre-Dame de la Mer, Saint-Jean, Saint-Yves, over the course of the years, that served these French fishers off the coast of Newfoundland. They offered sacramental services as well, and the purpose of this ship was for the church and the society to be present where the fishers were. Not just to wait for them to come home, but to be there where they worked. And after 1939, finally, when there was a decline in the number of French fishers, they moved their focus back to work more in France. Though largely forgotten now, it should be underlined that most of this work happened before the modern Stella Maris even began in 1920. This was one of the important forebears of modern Stella Maris work. And it was one of the first big fishers initiatives in North America that is now perhaps forgotten in the pages of history. Chapter 2. No doubt, alongside the French, the British were also keenly interested in the rich fishing grounds off of Newfoundland. Several English-connected missions arrived in Newfoundland and Labrador at the same time as the French. One mission in particular, the Royal National Mission to Deep Sea Fisheries, known as the Fishermen's Mission today, arrived in 1892 and recognized the deep needs also of British seafarers. Among other initiatives, they helped found the King George V Seamen's Institute, whose primary purpose was to provide wholesome temporary accommodations for fishermen, sealers, naval reservists visiting St. John's, and the daughters of fishermen and seamen who came to the city for work. This building was used by the Fishermen's Mission throughout the 1910s and the 1920s. During 1891, before this building was made, Francis Hopwood, who would later become Lord Southborough, visited Canada on behalf of the Board of Trade in the UK. He was a member of the Fishermen's Mission Council, and while visiting Newfoundland and Labrador, he made extensive notes to prove the very difficult conditions of the local fishers. His report in 1892 led to the founding of a mission in Newfoundland a year later. Of interest, this is just a curious historical fact, this building, the King George V Seamen's Institute, was one of the first buildings ever to have been founded remotely. How so? The cornerstone of this building, which still exists today, was set down by King George V himself on his coronation day, June 22nd, 1911. This was done through the agency of an electronic current from Buckingham Palace. After King George was crowned, he pushed a button and an electronic current went under the sea to St. John's, and that gave the signal to Governor Sir Ralph Williams to complete laying the stone on the governor's behalf. At the time, it was believed to be the first remote laying of a cornerstone anywhere in the world. Not to be outdone, the Americans, just a year later, founded the Port of Houston by having the president at the time push a button, and rather than laying a cornerstone, it shot a cannon. And that was the opening of the Port of Houston. Anyways, I digress. The incarnation of this mission was relatively short-lived. The building was commandeered later in the decade for use as a field hospital during the Spanish flu epidemic. It was repurposed, often being used for the daughters or wives of fishers, but it was also used in the Second World War, especially for the troop convoys coming to and from Europe during that time. Chapter 3. This very same building, the King George V building, had another life by another group in the 1950s and 60s. This became, again, a fisherman's center run especially for the Portuguese and the Spanish white fleets. In these news reports here, for example, from 1960, we see talk of 16,000 visitors coming to this center in that particular year. Though I could tell you about it a little bit more, I thought it might be much more interesting to see it and hear it.
Every fisherman likes to bring something home to his family. When the stores are open, the men leave the ships and walk to Water Street where there are many stores. Some of the shops have people working for them who can speak Portuguese, and they help us when we want to buy something. There is a fisherman's center here where we can meet our friends from the other ships. Sometimes we spend a quiet afternoon or evening reading, and sometimes they have movies for us. But many times we enjoy a good song together.
I think all of us need a little bit more fa-la-la-la in our lives. I hope that was a good excerpt from, this is from our national broadcaster CBC in 1967 at that Fisherman's Center. Chapter 4. The pastoral care of fishers was not only maintained by the Portuguese, but also significantly by the Spanish through the efforts of their Catholic missions. In 1963, the Spanish Catholic Mission established a Sailors' Day celebration to raise the awareness of the cause of the fishers in this territory. This was to recognize also that pastoral care alone was insufficient, that all sorts of acts of mercy needed to accompany that pastoral care. To address the broader needs of the community, the mission introduced a Spanish-speaking doctor to the city and set up a specialized Spanish fishers mission building that operated from 1973 to 1980. And this is it's the Spanish Seaman Center. The building was, this is from when it was erected in 1973. That building still stands, unfortunately, after 1980. This is a digression I shouldn't make. In the 1990s, this became an adult bookstore, unfortunately. And today, I went there just a few months ago, now it's a marijuana dispensary. So that very same building has a strange history afterwards. This period really coincided with the decline of the cod fishery, a big story in my country, an existential crisis that impacted Newfoundland and all nations connected to the cod stock. One notable figure at this time was Father Josepa Beobide, who worked both in St. John's and the adjacent territory of St. Pierre. Father Beobide was a steadfast advocate for fishers, documenting the downfall of the once vigorous Spanish fishing fleet due to cod depletion in his memoir, Hombres de Terra Nova, which came out just a few years ago. And Father Beobide actually just passed away last year. He championed the legal and moral rights of fishers and was a pain in the butt, really, for Canadian, for the Canadian authorities, and he was known as a great champion of Spanish fishers. He was present to witness and to conduct the all too frequent funerals of Spanish seafarers, such as the one in this news story about the 1977 victims of a trawler fire. In recognition of his work, actually, in his hometown in Escarabote, Spain, there's a street named after him. And in his book, this memoir, he collects 300 stories of seafarers which show all of the different challenges that the Spanish seafarers, that the Spanish fishers faced. He talked about two critical aspects of this activity: the significant increase in the capacity of fishing boats and the lack of supporting regulation. While focusing on Spain's cod fleet, Father Beobide emphasized the broader issue of overfishing by various countries in Newfoundland's waters. Following World War II, countries with historical ties such as France, Portugal, England, and Spain promoted large capacity vessels through their governments. Additionally, Eastern European countries like Russia and others like Japan joined the fray, leading to genuine overfishing. And by the 1980s, Canada had implemented strict fishing regulations within its EEZ, while nations without quotas, such as Spain and Portugal, exploited the fishery outside the EEZ. This exploitation resulted in a significant decline in both the volume and sizes of catches every year, with serious repercussions for cod stocks within the years covered. Father Beobide served the Spanish fleet from 1973 until 1998, and during that time was often known as the chaplain of the Spanish fishing fleet. So there's my story in 4 chapters, where we learned about a bit of the history in one specific port, service to fishers. What are a few of the lessons that we can learn? Well, first, from our 4-chapter story, we can learn about the amazing network of care for fishers. In the last several days, we've learned about how many NGOs, labor organizations, and others do work on behalf of seafarers. This is also my takeaway from St. John's. Even before Stella Maris even existed in 1920, for example, substantial work had been done by Catholic missions in specific. I work for ICMA, the International Christian Maritime Association, and we're an association that exists to promote this interconnected work between all these different missions and also other partners on the ground. The bulk of our members, these different logos, focus on merchant vessels, but a number also have focus on fishers. And you might know one or another of the logos on the screen, as you might know them in the different place where they operate. Our association was founded in 1969 and exists as this platform for networking, training, advocacy. We have a delegation, for example, that goes to the IMO and to the ILO, among other projects. And key among our existence is not simply that all of these members exist independent of each other, but we actively promote complementary work and find partners that amplify our strengths and support our weaknesses. In reviewing the history of the work at St. John's, But also in listening in the last few days, I note that we are not alone in this work, but we're in an ecosystem of care in our time, also in history. Each one of us, each one of these NGOs, and each one of the other groups has a place and voice that can find a way to serve with the resources that it has. I was impressed yesterday, even among Catholic charities, not only hearing about the official Stella Maris work, but so many of the other Catholic charities that work with fishers in one way or another. We can each be each other's cheerleaders and support each other. Second, the next lesson that I got from this little history of St. John's Fishers Welfare Care is that there's something that underpins a key notion of the care for fishers, especially from the Stella Maris tradition. This is perhaps one of the key points that those in Stella Maris and those without should understand. The current motu proprio Stella Maris of Pope St. John Paul II does not call for the care of fishers specifically, or just those who are visiting our ports, but really importantly, calls for the pastoral care of the people of the sea. And if you read motu proprio Stella Maris, you'll see that does not simply include those who are working, let's say, on a large fishing boat, but it includes all of those who are on board merchant ships or fishing vessels, all who for whatever reason have undertaken a voyage by ship. Includes marine personnel, seafarers, those who work normally on board a ship, those who work on oil rigs and platforms, pensioners retired from the aforesaid jobs, students of Nautical Institute, port workers are included. People of the sea includes seafarers and maritime personnel, spouses and children who are still minors of seafarers, maritime people as well as those who share a home with them even though they're not actual seafarers, and finally those who work in the maritime apostolate, us. All of those people are the people of the sea and need care. And in the history of the port work in St. John's, we can see how important it was to care not only for those seafarers on certain types of vessels, not only the fishers on certain types of vessels, but we saw so much different types of care of those at sea and also back home. And finally, in an interreligious and intercultural context, the story of St. John shows the intense highs and lows of 20th century of a place that received so many migrant workers from around the world. Newfoundland, as I already mentioned, was not actually part of Canada until 1949. Until that time, it had more or less autonomy from the United Kingdom, and until the dwindling of the cod stocks, the focus of the economy had been on fishing. Many different people groups came to fish in its waters over the history, and the bounty of the seas within its EZ and using Newfoundland ports for replenishing was amazing. The care of those fishers, however, was not only done by benighted or benevolent locals. Pastoral and practical care came also from their home countries. With great expense and lots of work, it took different organizations to send ships or send chaplains or send resources to help in founding things that were useful for those fishers. And it was intensely practical. The provision of dormitories at the King George V building, also for daughters of seafarers or for wives or other family members of those fishers. A place to relax on a Sunday afternoon away from the fishing vessel and sing a little bit. Provision of health care in the fisher's language. Services of remembrance and prayer upon the deathless seafarers in the cold, brutal North Atlantic. These services to provide finances to buy ships for visiting, erecting buildings, and sending priests to accompany seafarers in need were significant. And in our time, caring for fishers is intensely interreligious and intercultural. The lessons of 100 years ago remain the same. Focus on communication with fishers in their own languages. Focus on providing practical care ashore as possible, whether to help seafarers sing, give them a hot drink, or serve them in whatever way is possible. This isn't done by one catch-all institution, but done together, and it's something that we can celebrate, I think, even today. My role here today, and in this the last 3 days, is to be an encourager, a cheerleader, for those of you working day-to-day with fishers in need. Thank you for your work. If you'd like to know more about our work, you can scan this QR code or go on our website, and I would encourage you to sign up for our free monthly newsletter. Each month I focus 10 or 15 stories or so on the work of serving seafarers, fishers, and their families around the world. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jason, for that overview. So we've got 10 minutes for questions, but I just wanted to kick us off with a question to get us going. That was a really insightful history of the organisation and your network. I just wanted to ask, we've got the overview of the history, but what does the future look like for your organisation, and what's needed, to scale the positive impact that you've been having?
Thank you very much. I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you exactly what was going to happen in the future. It's not exactly known. But I think as part of our organization, the three things that animate us, this networking, professional development, and advocacy, all will continue to be important. I'm a really big advocate of networking. Coming together is something that is not just the sum of its parts. We aren't just here in our little silos. But bumping into each other at groups like this helps us learn about things we might not have known otherwise and might provide solutions to problems that we have. It was fascinating yesterday, for example, hearing the different country stories. I was unaware of certain of those country stories, unaware of those the people working in those places. I would not have known that had I not come here in person. So networking, I think, is one really big, important part of our work. Just going to a place and having a good time is not what I'm saying about networking. I'm actually saying doing the hard work of networking, actually meeting each other, sitting down, learning about each other first thing. The second one, I think, really importantly in our work in general is professional development. Learning about new things, learning how to grow, learning how to have higher standards. I find in so many ports we're being asked to do more things with perhaps less money. We're being asked to have a higher standard of care, professionalism, again with less resources. And to be able to do that really, it means people need to have more training and sort of know how to navigate the world. And then finally, advocacy. When we can bring our voices together to have a bigger, stronger presence, I think is going to be important. It always has been important, will be important in the future.
Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to open up the floor for questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question for Jason? Yeah, please, Sarah.
Thanks very much. Jason, thank you.
I think it is working. Just working quiet.
Thanks very much, Jason. Interesting, just going back to your story about St. John's, two things come from that. Yesterday I spoke about the Titanic disaster, and St. John's, of course, was the place where the survivors were taken to, so that care that was given the survivors there. And secondly, that notion of people of the sea that you were talking about. Actually, in St. John's, they have the Memorial University there, and at Memorial they have a really good educational and research center that looks at all aspects of the sea. So while it's different from the focus of your talk, it does show that they are the people of the sea, very much in St. John's. The roots of that are in fishing, the roots of that are in merchant marine, but they take it further into the future through that research. So just interesting on St. John's, really good place. Thank you.
The Titanic still has so many echoes and are almost direct links to our current world and current safety regimes, and we can spend lots of time on that. As it turns out, the reason I highlight this story is I've been working on it because we want to restart the Seafarers Welfare Center in St. John's, and one of our key partners is Memorial University. So a number of the professors at Memorial University sit on our local Seafarers Welfare Board, and we've we're hopefully opening something. It's kind of already started now, just very, very recently, and it's something that's really exciting new project. After about 20 years or so where there hasn't really been much in St. John's, now we're restarting something, and Memorial University is one of the key partners.
Excellent. It's a really great institute, and in fact one of our first projects some years back started in conjunction with them. So it's close to our heart. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eric. Is this on?
Yes.
I think I saw a question over here, is that no? Okay.
Sorry, just one moment.
So I think the question will be asked in Mandarin. People want to hear the question. You can have those.
我非常敬佩贵单位在做的事情。那因为贵单位看到贵单位这么努力的在做，我反观我们自己国内政府，他们花了很大一笔经费，在前镇渔港，在高雄的前镇渔港，在南方澳渔港，在屏东东港那边也都盖了很多的这种建筑物，非常大的建筑物，花了很多经费。但是后来我们才知道，他们把这些经营权、所有权通通交给了这些渔业团体在经营，所以他的渔业团体呢，所有已经变成是他们的公关手段啊，就去服务一些他们的渔民、他们的好朋友们到那边进驻，所以然后只是拿着这个渔工的名义来申请经费，所以我在想说，是不是贵单位有没有什么样的好的建议，可以把这种资源整合在一起，真正的实际用在这些渔工的身上？谢谢。
Well, thank you so much for the question. I would love to learn more about the situation here. I will be going to visit Kaohsiung port tomorrow to visit one of these centers. And so my first reaction is just I'd love to know more about the different programs and policies that are in place. The second thing I'd say is that this is a challenge not just here but around the world. The challenge of how local NGOs partner with government agencies and how that works. The issues here, or the challenges here, or the successes here, I think there's both success and challenge, are something that is shared in many different countries. Right now, for example, one of the big underlying currents in a number of different countries is how the impact on the merchant mariner side of the Maritime Labor Convention on local seafarers' welfare organizations. A few of the North European countries, even before the Maritime Labor Convention, had funding in place for seafarers' welfare and would share that with the local NGOs. But that wasn't common. It's not necessarily something common around the world. But now what we're finding in a number of countries, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Netherlands, France, and a few other countries along with them, is that the local NGOs are reading the Maritime Labor Convention, saying part of the guidelines in section 4.4 is the support of seafarers. In this, I'm speaking more of seafarers than merchant mariners and fishers, although there's overlap between them. The government, in one of the guidelines of 4.4, is the question where the government needs to give due consideration to support the facilities of seafarers' welfare ashore. So a number of these governments are wrestling with how that is going to happen. And governments around the world, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to know what to invest in. The additional challenge sometimes as well, and I'm speaking from a person who runs a Christian faith-based association, is sometimes how governments interact with religious groups and how they can or can't support their work. And it's not an easy question. So I appreciate your question, and I appreciate that it's a challenge here, and I would love to know more. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I think that's time for questions. So everyone could give a round of applause for Jason again. And thanks Great. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Father Peter John Pearson. He is the priest and Archdiocese of Cape Town, where he serves as Second Vicar General. He is also the Director of the South African Catholic Bishops' Conference Parliamentary Liaison Office, which is the official platform for engagement with issues of policy formulation and legislative endeavour in the South African Parliament. He has a particular speciality in issues of refugees and migrants, mining and the extractive industry, and international affairs. He is a member of several international organisations, including the Santa Marta Group, the Holy Land Coordination Committee, the Mining and Faith Reflections Initiative. He serves on the board of the Scalabrini Centre in Cape Town, South Africa, and the board of the Scalabrini Institute for Human Mobility in Africa. So please could you welcome Father Peter John to the stage.
Events have happened. Events have happened of which it is difficult to speak and impossible to keep quiet. I quote, of course, from Edmund Burke, and he was chronicling the abuses of the French Revolution when he penned those lines. He could as well have been talking about the gross movement of people from Africa across the world and sold into heinous slavery. He could well have been talking about this epidemic that is lurking in plain sight that we ponder today. They are the words that some future historian will also record of these brutal times of genocide, ethnic cleansing, collective punishment, which we're seeing in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. The epidemic in plain sight, this horrendous crime of trafficking in persons. Pope Francis has called it an open wound on the body of contemporary society. He's called it an atrocious scourge and has challenged us, and importantly, governments in particular, to note that we all can and must do more in reporting cases of exploitation and the slavery of women, men and children. In saying that, he offers a very powerful paradigm for advocacy. He calls us to influence policies and governments to increase the protection they offer, especially through the mechanisms of reporting. In my few remarks, I will use the Pope's paradigm of advocacy to interrogate the notion of reporting what is in plain sight. I will do it obviously in the broader context of a world which celebrates on paper a culture of human rights, governments that boast loudly of compliance with protocols such as the Palermo Protocol, and put in place appropriate legislation. And yet, and this is my difficult point, and yet, despite all of this that's been done, there continues to be a gap between between the legislation, the policies that are out there, and the lack of reporting. One major reason for this dissonance, and I use South Africa as the example because it's the only example I know. One major reason for this dissonance is that there is, in this form of modern slavery, as in all slaveries, a basic invisibility. Trafficking in persons employs the protection of invisibility, the protection of cultural bias, and the colonial commodification of human beings in a particular way. And these remain huge obstacles to giving publicity to the scourge and encouraging people to report. It is that invisibility that I want to interrogate as part of the dismantling of the veil that has covered this crime and somewhat allowed it to be concealed unnecessarily. As I said, post-colonial, post-apartheid South Africa is one example. I think there are three things that really stand in the way, that are obstacles to people engaging in reporting the crimes associated with trafficking, with the exploitation of fishers. At the very heart of the colonial project is the necessity to normalize the process of oppression through the erasure of oppressed people's dignity and agency, to render them voiceless. Once these have been erased, human beings count for nothing, can be enslaved, can be commodified in such a way that cruel exploitation towards them is normalized. And just from the reports we've heard over the last few days, that is the fundamental problem that's also hidden in plain sight, is that people have and people are so invisible that they can be enslaved in such terrible ways. At the very, so the oppression and the oppressive structures and the oppressive regimes on boats and across borders and land are normalized. And the normalization of oppressive practices and the social acceptance of these practices, such as the forced movements of people, is so ingrained in our social consciousness that trafficking in persons is able to be practiced without raising moral objections or even identifying it as something evil. Over the decades of apartheid in South Africa, this was codified and normalized through legislation. And the normalization of evil practices goes on naturally to create climates of voicelessness, climates of silence, climates of acquiescence. It removes the agency of victims and disempowers them so that it is difficult to respond or to resist. And we've heard stories of that in so many ways. It became at various levels a normalized culture of acquiescence and exploitation. And it's that silence that we who work in advocacy have to break. South Africa's forced movement of people is deeply embedded in its economic and political practices of forcing people off the land. Initially through forcing people to adopt a tax system, and then which was impossible to comply with without seeking work. And then they became vulnerable workers who could easily be transported against their will to different places. This began the practice of forcing people off the land and forcibly transporting them to mostly geographically distant places to meet the needs of a burgeoning mining industry and a growing agricultural enterprise, as well as meeting domestic needs. This pattern is so established that trafficking in persons has operated largely unnoticed under this guise for a very long time. It's often hard to distinguish the difference. Forced labor, which is now normal, a normal uncontested part of the labor domain, has provided a perfect cover for trafficking of all sorts. It's worth noting that not only has the practice become embedded in the wider culture, but the vocabulary that has grown up alongside it, especially in the field of labor, is now so domesticated that it is incapable or unthinkable of raising contestation. I think of words and phrases such as migratory labor, influx control, and the sanction of labor practices. South Africa is also a country that for the longest time concealed sexual exploitation, gender violence, and rape. It has, both in law and public perception, been regarded as something private, because most of it happens in domestic or work spaces. The violence of trafficking is thus also under the radar and regarded as private and transactional. Gender violence in South Africa has been acknowledged, especially during the time of COVID, as a second pandemic. These are things that, until quite recently, have not been spoken about. It has been one of the strongest areas of concealment. So for women especially to publicly report behavior such as gender violence and hence trafficking and rape would be in many cases hugely countercultural and psychologically and physically difficult. South Africa is a deeply patriarchal society, and this adds significantly to the culture of concealment. And we know in South Africa that a white militaristic and racist state, widespread defiance against apartheid and in the form of armed struggle and the patriarchal indigenous systems of law combined to spawn a particular kind of masculinity which left women in places of great vulnerability, but also left people who weren't fitting the norm in great vulnerability. From the above, it is clear that, especially in South Africa, but I would strongly suspect in other countries as well, I was asked to speak on South Africa, the two main areas of trafficking, sexual exploitation and forced labor, remains largely concealed and can continue to be easily concealed because there is a long historical, cultural veil that has covered it and allowed it to function with impunity. All this despite constitutional guarantees, progressive legislation, and strong NGO engagement. It speaks of the need for enhancing the agency of those caught in this dreadful predicament, of campaigns that allow people to break the silence. It seems our greatest task in advocacy for and with those who are trafficked is being a part of the dismantling of a culture of silence. We have the legislation, we have the processes in place, but what we don't have is the reporting. The silence that prevents reporting is something we need to break. We need to continue challenging and dismantling social norms that discourage communication about certain issues or environments when breaking the silence is severely punishable. While we can never hold back on our vigilance on policies and legislation, I believe that from an advocacy lens, the time is right to dismantle the culture of concealment, which remains one of the largest stumbling blocks to a culture of reporting and thus a time of exposing this crime against humanity. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that. So just want to turn the questions to the audience. Does anyone have a question? If not, I can start this off. Okay, I'll start this off. What you were saying about the gap in what you were saying about the gap in between policy, and the amount of cases, and the fact that these aren't being solved, that really resonated with me in the context of fisheries. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to what you had said about empowering workers and the importance of advocacy. I'm not sure if you're aware of the fishing situation here or in other countries, but how do you make sure you do that in the best way, where governments become receptive to that advocacy, and actually you start to see progress rather than it becoming a conflict within itself.
Yeah, I think there are, we've worked very consciously at 3 levels in our advocacy with displaced persons, with exploited workers, including fishers. And that is to say we need to continue to hone our skills to make a difference in places where we have leverage with government. We also need to continue in different forms, the educational dimensions of people just knowing through newspapers, through various other things, what needs to be done, what's happening around them. And then the activism. People on the barricades, people doing the protests. And we think when there's a combination of those 3 things, then we have a much better chance of engaging government and policymakers.
Great, thank you. Does anyone from the audience have questions? Yeah, Valerie?
Thank you, Father. I just wanted to comment that I think issues of racism and colonialism and really this invisibility, I think, I wanted you to speak a little bit more about that and your perspective, because there seems to be a sense that how we treat migrants is very different to how we treat people in our own countries. And the fact that we see that there is second tier, double tier, the way people are segregated, isolated, and then unable to access their rights, as, like you said, a matter of course. The normalization of treating the other very different like treating your own. And South Africa being a space, a moral and ethical space that we look to for how, the fight for racial and economic justice needs to continue. So I wanted to just praise you for bringing those topics into this room, and also, if you can comment a bit more, I would really appreciate it.
I think the one key point that I would say from where I sit is that all forms of exploitation are intertwined. They all belong to the same gross reality. And whether they establish themselves in the form of race, in the form of exploitation, in the form of gender inequality, they belong to the same thing. And we don't do a proper job of advocacy in one field if we are not also taking into account the other fields. So an interdisciplinary, interconnected, intersectional response is absolutely necessary.
Great. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay, if we have no more questions, can we please give a round of applause for the speaker? Hyland. He is a former UK police officer serving for 30 years investigating serious crime and heading London's Scotland Yard Human Trafficking Unit until 2014. He was appointed the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner and was elected as Ireland's representative to the Council of Europe experts groups on human trafficking until December 2022. From 2020 to 2022, he worked inspecting prisons and investigating deaths in custody across Ireland. He was on boards in the UK and the US focusing on human trafficking issues across the world. He is a master in law. In September 2022, he was appointed as Strategy Director for Global for the Santa Marta Group, a partnership of law enforcement, civil society and faith groups launched at the Vatican in 2014 and endorsed by Pope Francis. He chairs the G20 Interfaith Forum and leads efforts for the G20 nations to increase resources allocated to human trafficking prevention. He's received numerous awards for performing in human rights, including being appointed for policing, it's a typo there, for policing and human rights, including being appointed an Officer of the Order for the British Empire, OBE. by patron Queen Elizabeth II in 2015. So please join me in welcoming Kevin to the stage.
Good morning, and thank you for the introduction, Zach. Can I start by thanking the Bishops' Conference here in Taiwan, the Taiwanese executive, and of course Stella Maris for the invitation to be here today. But the fact that we're here today, and what we're talking about, and mine is about human trafficking and modern slavery, really brings shame on us as the incumbents of the world, that so much of our lives have become entwined and reliant, often unwittingly, on the existence of human trafficking and modern slavery. However, if we accept and acknowledge this phenomenon, then we can begin to right the wrongs. Pope Francis explains human trafficking in the way that he does, and he calls it, "The modern world feeds upon the powerless. Too many people are treated as consumer goods to be used and then discarded." The most recent estimates agreed by the United Nations only a couple of years ago is that 49.6 million children, women and men are exploited in human trafficking and modern slavery. And this enormous number of people generates $236 billion annually in criminal profits for the exploiters. The beneficiaries of this sum include multilateral corporations, governments, small businesses, well-established organised crime groups and individuals. But one thing these exploiters all have in common is they are criminals, either by the deliberate acts they do or through negligence. This is the second biggest generator of criminal profits, behind the 360 billion every year made out of the global drugs crime, but ahead of the $120 billion in illegal firearms crime. And Pope Francis has spoken about these profits, and he explains it very clearly. He says, "The money obtained by human trafficking from their dirty, underhanded business is blood money. I'm not exaggerating, it's blood money." So we need effective action to end human trafficking and modern slavery, and this must be sustained, collaborative, and involve multi-stakeholders. But governments are well positioned and have a duty to lead such efforts by committing to well-resourced counter-trafficking action plans commensurate to the risks human trafficking creates for those who suffer. The Santa Marta Group is engaging within the area of criminal justice actors, legislators, non-government organisations and faith groups to act as a catalyst to encourage change. Approaches need to be focused on prevention of exploitation, the well-being and recovery of victims, and the pursuit and the disruption of perpetrators, whoever those perpetrators may be. Good laws that enable prevention, deliver support for victims, and introduce sanctions are crucial. In fact, the UN Palermo Protocol, introduced almost 25 years ago, sets out what good legislation should include. This protocol is reinforced by the Council of Europe Convention, the European Union Directive, the ASEAN Convention, and many other international instruments, such as the 1934 Slavery Convention, the 2014 International Labour Organization Protocol, and many others, importantly, including the Working Fishers Convention of 2007, known as we know by C188. These instruments include essential elements such as support to victims, provisions of workers with residence permits, medical support, including mental health and many other provisions of services to those who are exploited. These anti-trafficking instruments speak of prosecution, targeting criminal assets and bilateral and multilateral collaboration. Having personally evaluated many nations on behalf of the Council of Europe and worked internationally as a police officer in the UK and internationally and as the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, I have yet to see a country with a legal framework or action plan that delivers the structures agreed in these conventions and directives or protocols. This is even so where implementation is mandatory, for example, in the European Union member states. This is especially true regarding the support offered to victims and efforts to deter and prevent this offending. All too often, there are complex demands placed on victims, becoming the only deterrent to them speaking or seeking support or to report their crime. The conflation of human trafficking and people smuggling can cloud the understanding of human trafficking, albeit people who are undocumented or smuggled are at a higher risk of being trafficked. It is important to remember human trafficking and modern slavery occur when an individual, a business, or an organised crime group decide to exploit a person. As Pope Francis said, feeding off the powerless. And these crimes are generally for financial gain or to save on labour costs at the expense of the most vulnerable, robbing people of their opportunity of dignity at work or to provide for their families. Many challenges remain to dismantle the economic, political and social structures that allow human trafficking and modern slavery to flourish. United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015 and launched by Pope Francis, include 3 significant specific targets centred on ending human trafficking. UN Sustainable Goal 5.2 is about eliminating all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other forms of exploitation. SDG 8.7 is take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labour, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labour, including the recruitment and use of child soldiers. And by 2025, end child labour in all its forms. And UN Sustainable Development Goal 16.2 is to end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against the torture of children. As Cardinal Breslin said on Tuesday, achieving these or any of the global targets for a better world is regressive, not progressive. So how can this mammoth task of eradicating the norms of human trafficking and modern slavery be achieved? The Santa Marta Group has introduced a 6-point strategy working across partners across the world. This strategy aims to emphasise the serious nature of human trafficking as a crime and human rights violation, and who needs to respond and why. The 6 points start with government procurement and business culture. Government procurement and business cultures must not benefit from human trafficking. Governments in particular must be free from any form of funding of human trafficking. 1 in every 5 units of currency in the world is spent by a government, and they have the authority, the know-how, and the ability to demand transparency in their suppliers and service providers. Private and public businesses and corporates play a crucial role in the world's development, providing opportunity to improve living standards for many. But a byproduct can never be forced labour and human trafficking. Willful blindness is tantamount to negligence, from which comes liability and culpability. In this aspect, there is some future progress. The European Union Directive on Forced Labour, the Australian Modern Slavery Act revisions, the increasing focus on the US Tariff Act and its customs and border protection, and other domestic legislation such as in Norway, France, Germany, Brazil, and pending Canadian due diligence style legislations all offer hope. Some of these frameworks will soon allow for sanctions for the companies who breach the rules. For example, the German laws allow for a 4% of the company's turnover to be a fine. However, these laws will need proper investment by business for prevention as opposed to only being reactive to being caught out. The second priority is tainted money, a new concept beyond that of proceeds of crime. If we really see human trafficking and modern slavery as abhorrent, then we should remove the profit, even when made unwittingly. This will bring change. In fishing, this would be a game changer. Technology and its online providers must be governed by law. No more than we would allow and tolerate the sale of children for exploitation or advertising on our streets. It must not be allowed to proliferate in the cyber world. And that's only one form of trafficking that happens online. And the responsibility for funding, the governance and the policing must sit with the online providers, not our taxes, which are for policing in our communities. Number 4 is understanding and implementing international instruments is important, and we've heard a lot about that today and the last few days. Many international instruments intended to protect fishermen exist. Instruments such as the ILO Organization Forced Labour Convention, the ILO Forced Labour Protocol, and the UN Paloma Protocol to suppress human trafficking are frameworks that should be incorporated into domestic laws and policy. They need to be understood and they need to be implemented, and those who don't implement them, have signed up to them, should be held to account. Encourage international bodies to develop models that suppress human trafficking is essential. Unions, as we've heard, are crucial. The World Bank, the World Health Organization, the International Criminal Courts, the European Courts of Human Rights. And importantly, as a crime that is all about creating financial profit, incorporating human trafficking into the work of the Financial Action Task Force could offer new forms of oversight in governments and heavy sanction. Currently, organised crime and terrorism is looked at within the FATF, but doesn't incorporate human trafficking as an organised crime element. So getting them to take it on board will mean sanctions are available. Being able to borrow loans as a company will become difficult or impossible if you haven't got ethical suppliers. Finally, and importantly, all of us here, leadership, shifting the dial. Leaders in government, business, faith and religions, police and law enforcement and civil society must demonstrate the leadership to drive the suppression of this crime in all areas of their responsibility. So this 6-point plan and implementing this ambitious systemic approach will require commitment and the delivery of many global promises. But crucially, it must be to prevent exploitation and suffering, to provide support to victims and hold those who exploit or benefit from exploitation to account. So how are we going to do that? At this year's G20 in Brazil, a priority of the G20 being pushed by the United States in particular and Brazil and many other G20 countries is about having a priority for sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. So this gives us an opportunity to work with the G20. And Santa Marta Group is supporting the G20 and has done since 2018 alongside partner nations to increase their political will and resourcing to end the socio-economic norms that allow and even promote human trafficking and modern slavery. The current 230 billion profit of those who benefit from this unbelievable sum currently operate with impunity. These criminals must feel reassured that only 1 in every 8,700 victims receives justice. This means that global detection rates are less than 0.2%, while victim identification is less than 1%. So this year's plan with the G20, being supported by other nations with the Santa Marta Group and the Interfaith Forum, is about leading by example, exemplo ducatus. By committing to invest $30 billion annually by 2030 across G20 countries, this money should be used to set up systemic approaches in human trafficking prevention, victim support, and criminal disruption. This is so important to actually achieving eradication as a model. So this will mean by 2030, when the 2015 UN Sustainable Development Goals end, and will obviously transfer to a new iteration of targets, human trafficking responses will be integrated into a systemic approach designed to protect the vulnerable and to create dignified work and to ensure that those who dare to exploit will lose their assets and be likely to face criminal sanction. Simply making this a crime that you dare not do will have consequences, and that consequence is that you won't do it. In the fishing sector, we need to see the owners, the captains and their agents brought to justice and the workers protected. This cannot happen until this is recognised as the world's most second profitable crime, with vile criminals trading in human suffering. I have met many victims of human trafficking and modern slavery across the world. These victims have been children, women and men whose chances of dignity are stolen, and in some cases I've met families whose loved ones have lost their lives. The International Labour Organization estimates that 22,000 children die in poor working conditions every year, and yet our responses don't meet that threat. We owe a duty to protect them, which requires an ambitious strategy like the one Santa Marta Group is proposing. $30 billion is only a fraction of the monies earned by the traffickers, and a small amount in comparison to the global commitments to address terrorism, drugs crime, or trading in guns. Human trafficking and modern slavery in all of its forms must become a global priority for prevention. Eradicating this global model that allows this serious crime and human rights abuse to proliferate and remain a lucrative venture at the cost and the dignity of almost 50 million children, women and men cannot be allowed to continue. 25 years on from the UN commitments to end this phenomenon needs new impetus and new direction. And why is this important? Well, a young girl that I met in southern Italy who thought she was safe, having escaped the threat of being recruited into the armed forces in Eritrea where she would be raped. Her family gave her a safe passage, they believed, to leave that threat. When she got to Libya, she was kept in a connection house and sold and sold and sold every day at a market. And then she'd be raped. This at 15 years of age. Then when she had earned enough money, she was placed on a dangerous vessel to cross the Mediterranean. She saw people floating in the Mediterranean, all this at 15 years of age. And then when she arrived, there was the initial reception, the welcome, but within a few days, she was living in accommodation with men. She was at risk. There was nothing to protect her childhood or to give her opportunity. The only thing she saw was running away from there and trying to find someone to support her. If that's the best we can do, we need to be ashamed. So we need to change that. And that's why I think we need this model Santa Marta Group is proposing. We know it won't be easy, and we hope that this will start to fund the fantastic work that we've heard over the last few days. So this becomes something that is looked upon as serious as terrorism. The importance of preventing it is as constant as it is with terrorism. and then we can start to achieve something where the model of modern slavery and human trafficking is something you simply don't do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. There's some pretty depressing statistics coupled with our story at the end, so just I think it shows the importance of the work you're proposing, whatever else's programs in the room. I wanted to open up the floor for questions for Kevin. It's always I have a question ready if people are hesitant. We do have a question. It'll be in Mandarin, this question, so if everyone wants to put their headsets on for that. Just grab one. Of course, yeah. So, everyone just needs to headset.
谢谢，我真的非常感动您刚刚的报告，有关于这个国家的责任的部分，我想请教，如果我们在国内的进行这个国内的倡议的时候，国家的责任，比方说渔船主，他们必须要被受到这个法律的规范，那因为我们现在目前的渔业的这个劳工是远洋渔业劳工是在受渔业法规渔业署管理，所以当他们在辅导这些渔船主的时候的同时，他们还在管理这个渔业劳工的这个问题，所以两边他们有点取舍，难取舍又要一边要辅导渔业主，一边又要来照顾劳工，这个可能会失衡。所以我不知道我们将来可以怎么样来把这样子的责任划分业务搞清楚。比方说，劳动部应该要更介入这样子的业务，应该是回归到劳动部来管理，不应该是由渔业署球员兼裁判这样子的角色来管理。
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things you can't do when you're creating a global plan like this is to dictate each country's model. That would be foolish, because if you take a country like Australia, they brought in due diligence laws and they're now toughening them up, and they would be very different to say the way that Norway's done them. But they both have the same effect. So what we need to do is to have this global push. Particularly, this is more about business culture. And we heard a lot here about, vessels that keep turning off their transmitters, vessels that don't have Wi-Fi, vessels that don't pay people. And then there should be information that's gathered so that when people are trading in a country, they know, right, we're not going to deal with that company. So it's more about a business requirement. And that has to be by law, and in the EU it will be. So let's take, for example, there's a big vessel, one of these big super ships floating around in the oceans around here, the Pacific, and it's got a Customs and Border Protection ban on it from the US. And that means the US will not trade with it. They cannot bring any goods into the US. But it also means any proceeds or processing that comes from that vessel cannot go into the US. So they've lost a big client, a massive client. But then they may find other clients that will fill the gap, maybe not to the same extent. So if we can start bringing that in, so we've got Australia at the moment that's doing it, we've got the UK that's got fairly weak laws around this, that's looking at toughening it up. So we've got the distance of the two ends of the world, and now we've got the EU, so the 27 countries there are going to have something. It's going to have to be a business, it's essential. When I hear this is too tough, if I buy food in Ireland where I live, and I get ill from it, I can sue the hotel or the supplier. They will sue their supplier and it will go back. In Ireland, there was what's called the horse meat scandal some years ago, and it was Ireland that identified it across the whole EU because it has very high standards about food. And then what we did is the whole of the EU had to check all of the meat standards because horse meat is being sold as beef, and it was organised by criminals. But the standards identified it, and then when it found it, there was big sanctions. And no one would dare do that now in the EU, because if you were caught, sanctions are too great. And for example, social media platforms in Ireland were fined 1.4 billion euros recently, 1.4 billion for not managing material properly that was at risk to children. So we can do it around social platforms, we need to do the same around human trafficking. And that's why this is a 5-year plan to 2030 and into the next iterations. We're not going to do this in 6 months, a year. This is a plan that's going to take 5 to 10 years to become the norms.
Okay, great, thanks. We actually had a second hand up already.
Hello. Thank you, Kevin. Would you mind to go back to your second slide? Is it possible, please?
Can you put it on?
The one that you show the profit.
Yes, okay, yeah.
I think it is. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you're going to say that most of the profit is in Europe.
Yes, thank you. What
It's
really
coming up now.
caught my attention is the second one, the second area that is the most profitable, which is the Middle East. At any given time, there are millions of migrants in the Middle East.
Yes.
Probabilities are the same is applicable to the next one, please. Next one, thanks. Next. It's not the second. Yeah, that's the one. If you look there, the yellow column, it says Arab states. It goes straight to the point without charging anyone. The track record of those guys, plus some others here in Asia, in terms of human rights, is rather poor. If you talk about business culture, there we are. How can we sort of bring these guys to accountability? Because they sound like the new players in business, like airlines. They are taking over the airlines. They are taking over a number of things. Anyway, thank you, guys.
So I'll give you an example. The UN second largest event every year is called the Commission of the Status of Women. In March every year. And the Holy See has a major role in that. And always, we had a big event there last year with the Philippines and the Holy See and a number of other countries. Next year, hosting that event, because countries have their term, is Saudi Arabia. And of course, there's a lot of questions being asked about that. But there was one great thing, and I was at an event recently where there was a lot of objections to it, and I said, but we've got them in the room. And I think Jason has said very clear, you need to be talking to people perhaps that you don't always talk to. And we've got them in the room, and we can start saying to them X, Y, and Z. Now, we know they'll roll out the red carpet, and it will be a great event, but there needs to be some requirements of them. And unless we're talking to them, and we're, and believe it or not, they are actually thinking about how they can support this G20 Interfaith Forum plan with Santa Marta. They are looking to support it in some way, shape or form. It's not agreed yet, so we're talking the right things. These are slow burns, as we know, and the world is full of problems. But we just have to keep in our lane, doing our bit, keep very focused.
Okay, thanks everyone for the questions. I think we're out of time. I'll save my question for lunch, Kevin, if you can actually just let everyone else does the same when you get their question in. Okay, so can we please say Okay, thanks. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Detective Chief Superintendent Colm Noonan. Colm is part of the Irish National Police Service. I'm not going to attempt the Irish version of that, Colm, so I'm going to embarrass myself with the pronunciation. Since November 2001, he has been the head of the Garda National Detective Services Bureau, where he has the strategic responsibility in Ireland's National Police Service for the response to and investigation of crimes involving domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. GNPSB also conduct investigations into certain complex cases, They are also the National Bureau responsible for the response in respect to sexual crime, online child exploitation, child protection, sex offender management, human trafficking, missing persons and victims. Could you please join me in welcoming Colm to the stage? Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation to speak. So I'll be able to pronounce who we are. So it's called, my organisation, it's Ireland's National Police Service, An Garda Síochána. It's Irish for Guardians of the Peace. So it's a national police service and covering the 26 counties of the Republic of Ireland. So structurally, as I say, we cover the entire island except Northern Ireland. But as was pointed out to me recently, in the United States there's over 16,000 law enforcement agencies. In Ireland there's just one, and it's us. So we have responsibility for all crime investigation, all state security. And my specific responsibility, and I won't go through all of these, but I'm a Surrey police officer, obviously, but I'm head of what's called the National Protective Services Bureau. And you can see on the bottom of the screen the variety of areas of responsibility that we have. But right in the centre there, we have human trafficking investigation. So all human trafficking investigations across the island are essentially overseen by us and coordinated by us. And most importantly, I think from a strategic perspective, we are trying to develop, and my presentation today will focus on how we're trying to develop those investigations, how we're trying to support victims of human trafficking in a better way, but primarily because I'm a police officer and because I want to get offenders before courts, we need to look at how we can use existing legislation to get those offenders before courts. Everybody here who's involved in human trafficking knows the life a victim of human trafficking experiences and how traumatic it is and how difficult it is and how they are continuously exploited and re-traumatized. And that follows through, unfortunately, to the criminal justice system. So we are looking at methods of how do we identify and prosecute offenders, the organised crime gangs who are behind human trafficking. How do we bring those before the courts without the need to bring victims before the courts, without the need to re-traumatise the victims, and without the need to potentially not successfully prosecute those offenders. So that's what my presentation will focus on. I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview of, in the law enforcement world, and this is not unique to Ireland, but what we see in the law enforcement world in respect to human trafficking. So primarily it's going to be sexual offences, sexual exploitation in Ireland. We do have forced labour in Ireland, lesser prosecutions, lesser investigations, and we have had some work in respect of fishers as well. So I'm going to talk about how we're trying to progress that. And again, these are just to give an overview. You can see the law that we're trying to deal with. So not only our own domestic law, the Criminal Law Human Trafficking Act, but we're obviously guided by our Constitution. We're guided by the Palermo Protocols, by the Warsaw Convention, by illegal immigrants trafficking acts. So there's lots and lots of domestic law that guides how we do our business. One of the key distinctions that we have made in our bureau is that we have separated immigration offences investigations from human trafficking investigations. So they're quite separate things. And it has really proved beneficial, because what I don't want is a human trafficking investigation commencing and that victim not cooperating with us because he or she is afraid of being deported, because he or she is afraid that they may have committed immigration offences and will be prosecuted for those. So any victim of human trafficking in Ireland is not subject to immigration offences. So as soon as they're identified as a victim of human trafficking, that disappears. And in the forced criminality world, which we have investigated over the last year, we've had a number of successes where a person who was forced into labour, forced into growing cannabis for organised crime groups, was imprisoned. We successfully worked with our Director of Public Prosecutions to have that person released from prison because we've identified them as a victim of human trafficking, and the supports that go with that kick into place. So it is quite difficult, and I think everybody in law enforcement, and we work with our colleagues across the world in law enforcement, it is extremely difficult to prosecute a case of human trafficking. Extremely difficult. In Ireland, this is what we have to prove, and this will become relevant when I speak about the fishers, but we have to prove the method, the means, and the purpose. The method, we'll all understand: recruitment, transport, receipt, or harbouring. We'll understand the final one, the purpose: is it for sexual exploitation, labour exploitation, forced criminality, or organ harvesting. They're all quite simple, but it's the one in the middle which is extremely difficult for us. So we have to, in law, show that the victim there's been a threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, and abuse of power. Payments have been made, and benefits have been achieved, and the person is under the control of another person. That's what we have to show, and that creates quite a difficulty in prosecuting cases. So while we work very closely with our Director of Public Prosecutions, who is the decision maker in bringing cases to court, without all of those proofs being present, we can't succeed in an Irish court. And you'll understand why I'm focusing on this when I come to what we're trying to do. So just to give a little flavour of what we're seeing, the vast majority of human trafficking that we see in Ireland is sexual exploitation. And we have recognised, and the first point is the most important, we've recognised that human trafficking, including sexual exploitation, including forced labour, is run by transnational polycriminal organised crime groups. So groups that are involved in all types of crime. Human trafficking is just one of their crime types. But they are drug traffickers. They are importing firearms. They're involved in the sale and supply of drugs across the country and indeed across the world. And one of the things they're also doing is supplying people into our country and every country in the world for sexual exploitation, for labour exploitation. So that's why we're targeting them. Critically, I suppose, we see, particularly in the labour exploitation world, that the trafficker is central to their function. We have a number of investigations across the country at the moment where the trafficker and indeed the property becomes the focus. So the trafficker controls the employer, the trafficker controls the victim, and the trafficker controls the finances of those victims. So the employers oftentimes, and Kevin has mentioned it previously, the employer is a bona fide employer, is of good standing in the community, maybe a government agency, but they're paying, we have seen a number of cases where they're paying employment agencies for workers, but that employment agency is run, is controlled, and is staffed by the organised crime group. So that becomes our focus. A couple of live examples, just to give you a flavour before I move on to the fisheries side, but a couple of live examples. One of the operations, and it's just to show the cooperation, is between ourselves, Romania, and the UK. And I suppose the benefit of this, the beauty of this from a police perspective, is that we can, through existing protocols and existing police cooperation, prosecute offenders in under organised crime legislation, no matter where they reside. So this particular one had a complex network of women working in the sex industry in the UK and in Ireland, and obviously being controlled then in Romania. But we started targeting the group, and we targeted their finances. And you can see that actually the operation culminated in a joint day of action in Romania and Ireland, where I had police officers going into the houses of suspects in Ireland, Romanian police had police officers going into their suspects over in Romania, and it ultimately ended up, just for one investigation, of over €1 million worth of assets seized and just under €500,000 of cash seized. That's just, 10 suspects, one relatively small organised crime gang working across Europe. This is the ones that were relevant to Ireland, and that's the kind of success we can achieve. A second one, which again, Just to give you an idea of the cross-world element of it is two Brazilian victims who made complaints. They were in Ireland and were trafficked here for the purposes of sexual exploitation. The gang, we also prosecuted that gang for over €1.5 million in money laundering. So we're targeting not just their activities, we're targeting their assets. And we have the legislation to do that. That involves us working at a forensic level with a huge amount of financial institutions. And you can see all the ones, and that's just for that investigation. That's how that organised crime gang were moving money. They were transferring money through national banks, they were transferring money through Western Union, through MoneyGram, through Revolut, all across the world. And we chased all that money across the world and were able to seize 28 bank accounts ultimately and a huge amount of cash. Across Ireland, and Ireland's a small country, but you can see that those blue highlighted spots are properties that the organised crime gang had control of. They were sending women into those properties every single day who were repeatedly exploited, repeatedly abused, day in, day out, and we targeted those properties. It really is, I think, the way we need to move human trafficking investigations forward. And again, just the last one on this side of the sexual exploitation, another Romanian gang, and this is the first time, this is critical for us, and it goes back to my introduction. Our Director of Public Prosecutions directed that gang, those people, those individuals, be charged with 109 charges in total. And it's the very first time that organised crime charges have been directed in respect of human trafficking for us. And there are life sentences associated with these crimes. That's directing and supporting and facilitating the running of an organised crime gang. And when I get to the conclusion of my presentation, you'll see how that works in reality in the same space. Again, you'll see we seized over €800,000 from a money laundering perspective from that same gang. These are live investigations. These aren't made up. These are investigations that my teams are involved in as we speak. We have some labour exploitation, and we've successfully been able to investigate one in particular, where we have, and you'll see in the bottom half, 2 suspects charged in respect of human trafficking offences and money laundering offences. So every single human trafficking investigation, be it forced labour or sexual exploitation, involves us having to get into that network. Identify who are the people, identify where the bank accounts are, identify where the houses are, identify how the money is moving across to other jurisdictions. That's the kind of space that we work in. And again, that's finally, this is a labour exploitation that just is still live before the courts. 8 victims from Eastern Europe forced into labour, complex investigation, and we have 3 Slovakian suspects now charged with organised crime offences. So that's just to demonstrate the shift between, rather than charging for human trafficking offences, we are now charging them with organised crime offences. And that undoubtedly will have an impact in the fisheries industry as well. I'm just going to speak, I suppose, briefly on the scenario with fisheries and the investigation that it led to in Ireland. So there's something called the Atypical Working Scheme. I know Michael is here, Michael's very familiar with it, yeah. And it was something that ran in Ireland in 2016, and essentially to allow the employment of non-EEA crew as part of the Irish commercial sea fishing fleet. And it had its good parts and its bad parts. I won't get into the detail of that, but what I will say is that all of those government agencies around the outside of that circle signed up to a memorandum of understanding to monitor how that worked in the fisheries industry. And I think it created a space where we had a number of victims approached on the Irish Economy, approached the police to identify that they were victims of human trafficking and what that led to. It was to allow for the legitimate work of fishers on board ships. It was supposed to be a good thing. I think Michael would be a fair thing to say, but it hasn't quite panned out that way. So one of the operations that led from that was an investigation that commenced in 2018, where there were a total of 24 complaints from non-EU fishers who were working, and they were identified as potential victims of trafficking. And I know you're all familiar with these allegations: long hours, insufficient rest, that they were treated differently to other crew, that they were subject to poor safety, that there was verbal abuse, that they were threatened about being sent home to their home country. Serious allegations. And it led to the commencement of an investigation. But I suppose, unfortunately, from my perspective, it led to a decision not to prosecute from our Director of Public Prosecutions. And the concerns that were highlighted there, the prosecution issues that were highlighted there, was really an inability for us and for the state to identify sufficient evidence. Issues around the suspects that were identified didn't facilitate the entry of the fishers into the state. There was insufficient evidence around catches being falsified. There was insufficient evidence that there were threats, abuse, coercion, or deception. One of the key elements of human trafficking for us to get into court. There was no evidence of forced labour. These are all things that the Director of Public Prosecutions came back to us and said, your investigation has not identified these. And because it doesn't identify those, we will not prosecute for human trafficking. So clearly something has to change. And I think the change from our perspective is going to be around shifting, as I say, from human trafficking offences to organised crime offences. We have a national action plan in Ireland on preventing and combating human trafficking, and it does set out that not all labour exploitation is trafficking for forced labour. Workers can be found working in poor conditions for low salaries, unhealthy environments, without necessarily being victims of trafficking. So as long as that is the judicial position, as long as that is the legislative position in Ireland, we as police officers need to understand and figure out how else we can bring prosecutions before the courts. To assist me, I have colleagues in what's called the Criminal Assets Bureau, staffed again by members of Garda Síochána, and it's a state body, but it gives police officers, it gives the Criminal Assets Bureau legal authority to the civil burden of proof, which is something I deal with every day, but it's certainly, the civil burden of proof is a lot lower than the criminal burden of proof. So the civil burden of proof is on the balance of probabilities, criminal is beyond reasonable doubt. So it's a lot lower level to prove. Simply put, if I have to prove to a civil level, is it more probable that something is true than not true? And if I can prove that it's more probable, then the court has to accept it. So this bureau, which is a law enforcement bureau, works to that lower burden of proof. And it allows us to target the assets and freeze the assets, seize them, confiscate them, and sell them. And we use it all the time. And we're working very closely with that bureau now to target the assets and to freeze the assets and to seize the assets of organised crime gangs who are behind human trafficking. One of the ones I know some people maybe in the room will be familiar with is a group called the Kinnan Organised Crime Group. These are primarily drug traffickers. They control probably the entire cocaine supply in most of Western Europe. They're an Irish-based organised crime gang who work out in the Middle East. Just maybe don't take photographs of these slides, just these particular ones if you don't mind. These are live investigations. But you can see the kind of money that's involved there. It's absolutely huge. You know, there's 20 million value of controlled drugs seized, 7.5 million in cash, 79 persons convicted, 12 murders, 23 attempted murders, 13 firearms, 17 million money laundering, 17 million in drug trafficking, 2,000 rounds of ammunition. This is a criminal gang involved in drug trafficking primarily, who also will assist and will supply victims to human trafficking. So we've targeted them, and the targeting of them, and this is the model we're running at, they're the people involved. Anybody from Western Europe will know them, but they're a family group who are primarily based in the Middle East, now Dubai, who move across the world. So one of the ways to target those was to cooperate with our colleagues in the United States. So the cooperation at international level between us and those US agencies has allowed, and indeed the NCA, which is in the United Kingdom, and Europol, which is across Europe, it has allowed us to target those specifically. And one of the key bits there is that the United States have put up rewards of $5 million each for each of those people. So I'm putting this into the presentation because this is the space that we need to get into in human trafficking. We need to identify those particular individuals. If they're involved in human trafficking, we then need to work with our colleagues across law enforcement in the world and get to this very safe space. So these people can't move around the world, essentially, because if they cross any border and they're identified, they get arrested. The person who identifies them gets paid $5 million, and they get prosecuted. So that's what we're trying to do. This is all an Irish police-led initiative working with international partners to target organised crime groups. And that's the space that we need to move into in human trafficking. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Scott. That's much louder. Okay, no, thank you again. I mean, I think we're seeing there's a little bit of a common theme here, which is the scale of the challenge that's certainly coming through. I didn't get to ask my question for the last speaker, so I'm going to start. Kick us off. I wanted to ask about, it was interesting to hear about the process for prosecution and investigating the crimes. I mean, in fisheries, I think what most groups will communicate here is we're just inundated with cases that need to go through processing. And there's not necessarily the systems to do that, or the processes in place, and not everything meets the threshold for policing, for example. But it seems like Ireland have that system in place to a degree. Like, could you speak to what needs to happen there? Because it feels what? Sorry, I'm getting feedback. Could you? From behind you. Yeah, could you speak a bit about what needs to happen, or what governments need to put in place to improve those systems?
Yeah, sure. I suppose the first thing from a law enforcement perspective is that our police officers need to understand what human trafficking is. They need to understand how difficult a victim's life is and how big a decision it is to even contact us as a police organisation. How big a step it is to actually say, I need your help, I need your assistance. So from a police perspective, the more that come to us, the better. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to be successfully able to prosecute them, but at least we can start the process. At least we can identify, is there potentially human trafficking here? Is there an organised crime gang that we can start targeting? Are there immigration offences? Are there revenue offences? Are there other offences? So I think the beauty of Ireland from a police perspective is that all of those decisions rest with us. We don't have to go to another agency to say, we'll commence an investigation. It's my decision instead of the Bureau to commence an investigation. While there are other prosecutions possible, criminal prosecutions for human trafficking, rest of us to commence. So I think that, if I can say it, that free flow to police and that lack of bureaucracy is probably the key learning. And when I speak to my colleagues across Europe and in the United States about this, they're amazed at the fact that we have that level of autonomy. So I think for other police forces to be able to get to that space where essentially they have a central bureau of investigation where all the decisions in respect to human trafficking are able to do that, it's probably the model I would focus on.
Jason, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is perhaps a follow-up from the first one, and it's in specific the case that you were talking about with Fishers, about the inability of the state to find sufficient evidence. Was that because there wasn't sufficient evidence? Could you have got sufficient evidence if the fishers in question had provided more information, etc., or was the answer that was given, for example, that they sort of freely knew what they were doing, they knew what they were getting into, and so that it wasn't human trafficking, it was something else. So my question is, if those fishers had more tools to know how to gather evidence and present evidence, if they would have had, for example, yesterday we heard about having Wi-Fi on board or something like that. If they had more tools, more education, more knowledge, could they have helped you make the evidence, or was it a sort of never going to reach that threshold of sufficient evidence in that particular case?
Yeah, definitely the former, Jason. Definitely that if the tools are available, if the knowledge, if the awareness, if the understanding is there, that will assist us. Yeah, like, I don't think it's ever a case of the evidence doesn't exist. I think from a policing perspective, it's always a challenge to get at the evidence at, in the right time, in the right format, and in a way that we can then use it to prosecute. So we might all know it's there, but we mightn't be able to put our hands on it. We might know that this particular fishing group is controlled by an organised crime gang, but we just can't get the documentary links or the financial links to show that. So from a victim's perspective, and I think we're seeing it in the sexual exploitation world because of the level of awareness campaigns that are run, because of the level of NGOs that work in the sexual exploitation space, that victims of human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation come to us with a much higher understanding of what they're experiencing and what we need to prosecute. So I think absolutely it's a form that more education, more information will assist us.
Okay, we have a question from ITF next, and then the lady.
Yeah, I found the presentation quite informative, particularly the focus on organised crime. But I have to say, from the Western European perspective, the cases I would be directly familiar with from Ireland, the UK, and typically French and Spanish vessels, all of which would also operate in Irish waters, is that it's not an organised crime profile. We're dealing with employers who wouldn't be that way connected. And in terms of the former trafficking, it's trafficking by deception in the main, in the sense of the conditions of work promised to fishers in their country of origin being so at odds with what they encounter when they arrive in Europe. And that could be at the level of pay, working hours, but also could be at the level of being offered what they believe is legal work, but transpires what they land with is illegal work. So I'm not sure the organised crime focus will make the difference in a Western European context when it comes to achieving a prosecution in fisheries. I think that the problem we have in Ireland, and I dare say the rest of Western Europe, that human trafficking can carry a life sentence. It's a very, very high bar, and I think it's a big leap for the DPP to go down the road of prosecuting an Irish vessel owner. But the problem is the only other offences that remain are down here. It's district court prosecutions by the Labour or Maritime Inspectorate. And the problem we have is a culture of repeat offending and the fines not being dissuasive. So maybe we need an intermediary offence of labour exploitation that doesn't yet exist in Irish law and in the statute books of other Western European countries. It's not quite human trafficking, but that's I know you can't comment on policy matters, but I think that's what we're lacking in an Irish and Western European context.
Yeah, I totally agree with the second point, Michael, that an intermediary offence would make, provide a lot of clarity. I suppose to be clear on the organised crime legislation, it doesn't have to be this big gang. It doesn't have to be this network of, arch criminals who are moving from country to country. If there's an organisation that is benefiting from crime, financially or physically, then they can be investigated and prosecuted for organised crime offences. They are an organisation whose purpose whose purpose is maybe not primarily criminality, but who benefit from criminal acts. So if we can show that there have been criminal acts, if we can show that that's at an organised level, then we have a good shot at getting the DPP to run with organised crime offences. Will it work? I don't know. But up to last year and the year before, we weren't even looking at human trafficking in that space. And I know it works with a couple of the cases that I pointed out, because the DPP had said run with 108 charges for organised crime. So let's see how that goes before the courts, but I think it's worth pursuing.
Okay, I can see we had one person in the queue and a couple of other questions. We are out of time, but we do have an extra lunch break today. So if you can approach Colm and ask questions there. Sorry about that, but I think we had the important questions. Okay, thanks so much, Colm. Can everyone please join me in thanking Colm? Okay, so I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Martin Foley. Martin is a lawyer by training, with almost 20 years leadership experience in the charity sector. Prior to joining the Arise Foundation, where he currently works, he served as the CEO for Stella Maris UK for 13 years, and was also the European coordinator for Stella Maris. In 2020, Martin was appointed by Pope Francis as a consultor to the dicastery for promoting integral human development. So yeah, please join me in welcoming Martin to the stage.
Thank you, Zach. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for inviting me to speak to you this morning about the work of Arise. But as Zach has said, and as my predecessor at Stella Maris said yesterday, Tim, it was my time at Stella Maris that gave me my first exposure to the crime of human trafficking and modern slavery. And I see my current role with Arise as an extension of that work, that experience with Stella Maris. And it's a real privilege to work in this particular field. Now, Arise, unlike Stella Maris, is a relatively new charity. So I'd like to begin by just explaining who we are as Arise Foundation. We are an anti-slavery, anti-human trafficking NGO. We were founded in 2017, and we currently have 4 country programs: India, Albania, the Philippines, and Nigeria. And the key insight that led to the foundation of Arise was that frontline groups and networks hold the key to ending slavery and human trafficking. And our role within Arise is to build their strength, sustainability, and direct impact. I saw that for myself during my tenure at Stella Maris. It was the frontline chaplains and pastoral workers of Stella Maris that are the key to supporting those who are susceptible to being trafficked, to being abused, and exploited. As a new organisation, I'd also like to share with you the values that underpin our work. Because when we're trying to explore collaboration with each other in our shared endeavours and in our shared missions, it's important that our values align. And Arise has 3 fundamental values. They're listed there. The pivotal value, respect for human dignity, drives everything we do. I know it's shared by all of you in this room. The other 2 values, humility, recognizing the expertise and the knowledge, the insight exists with those on the front line. And therefore we need to recognize the limits of my knowledge and experience, deferring to those on the front line. And then trust. Trafficking, modern slavery, are crimes that erode trust. So our response must be founded upon trust. And again, an insight that I gleaned from my tenure at Stella Maris was just how significant the trust that exists, that's built up over years of repeat visits, trust between chaplain, seafarer, fisher, his or her family. And it's that trust that then enables the work to be undertaken. So that when a crisis hits, when there are problems, the chaplain, the pastoral worker is able to respond effectively because over years, trust has been established. A number of our speakers throughout this conference have articulated the challenge that we face. Kevin spoke about this morning. More slaves in the world than ever before. But within our eyes, we believe that we must address the root causes. Our focus is prevention. Locally led interventions are key. And a networked response is vital. Because trafficking is a networked crime that requires a networked response. And another insight that again was pivotal in the foundation of Arise is that often, and I speak as someone who lives in Western Europe, in the drive towards secularization, the role of faith groups, people of the Christian faith, or Muslim faith, other faiths, is overlooked, seen as irrelevant. We need to sort of get with the sort of progressive movement. But actually, faith groups are pivotal to addressing the crimes of slavery and human trafficking. And our mission is very simply to build the strength, sustainability, and direct impact of frontline groups working to prevent slavery and human trafficking. And the key word here is prevention. Arise is a charity focused exclusively on preventing the crime of human trafficking. There are other organisations doing incredible work in the field of protection and rescue. Our focus is preventing trafficking taking place in the first place. To address the root causes, otherwise we are left dealing with its harrowing consequences. Raising awareness on the reality of human trafficking. A key component of our work is providing viable alternatives to those who are vulnerable to abuse and exploitation, through education, provision of alternative employment, income generation, providing access to state services, identifying safe or safer migration pathways. And there are 4 pillars of the work of Arise, and I'd like to just explain these to you. Our projects, currently in our 4 countries, India, Albania, the Philippines, and Nigeria. Providing grants to frontline groups, and these are accompanying grants. Again, not just remotely sending funds from the UK to frontline groups, but actually getting alongside them, understanding them, their needs, their requirements, how we can walk with them in their journey. We also support the development of networks against human trafficking. As I said earlier, this networked crime requires a networked response. Amplification. Helping frontline voices to advocate at national, regional, global levels for the change that they want to see. And then research. To date, research has been an important component of the mission of ARISE to improve the interventions on the front line and enhance their effectiveness. For example, on our website, there is a piece of research entitled Trust and Liberation. It goes back to one of our values, trust. And in that research, academics have identified the importance of trust between a frontline group, whether it be Stella Maris, another NGO, a religious sister, and people at risk of abuse and exploitation. And what we sought to do through that piece of research is really articulate to perhaps a sceptical audience the way in which these frontline groups, particularly from a religious perspective, engender trust. And that trust is an antidote to abuse and exploitation. So the reason, or one of the reasons why I'm here today, is to extend an invitation to those of you in this room and those you represent to learn more about ARISE, to dialogue with us about how we can walk with you and support you in your fight, in our fight against abuse and exploitation. You'll all have these slides sent to you after the conference. My contact details are here. We have, as a new organisation, a limited capacity, but we're growing that capacity all the time. And we want to work with frontline groups in preventing human trafficking and modern slavery in the first place. Thank you for listening. I'll pause there. Happy to take questions.
Great, thanks Martin. So before we start Q&A, we've just been informed we actually have additional time in the schedule before lunch, so there's an additional 30 minutes. So we'll start with questions for Martin, but then because there were questions for the other speakers that we didn't get to, we'll, after we're done, we'll open up the floor to Colm and Kevin. So yeah, does anyone have any questions for Martin to kick us off? Everyone's ready for lunch, clearly.
So I see the questions, which is good.
I mean, I'll just ask very, very high level. It's good to get that overview of ARISE and the, the strategy in the presentation. How would you contextualise, what ARISE are doing and what we've heard in the room about, priorities for fishing? We know there's this gap in legislation and implementation. It seems that, even the talks today, a lot of the focus has been on remediation and addressing things after they happen. And we already know that's the scale of a challenge. But what about prevention and, how do we start prioritising prevention and dealing with that in a meaningful way?
Yes, I think that's a good point, Zach. Prevention is key. When I was at Stella Maris, I met a privilege of meeting, unfortunately in many respects, because they landed up in ports in the UK and had been the victims of abuse and exploitation. In many cases, they didn't really know where they were in the world. They had been duped. They had been exploited, financially exploited, physically exploited, And had they known prior to departure what they would encounter, they would not have left their country of origin. So I think, therefore, the work of prevention in engaging with individuals before they embark on migration is critical. We're exploring potential partnership with my former colleagues in Stella Maris in the Philippines around prevention, and we like to scale that up so that information is power. And that's not to negate the important rescue work and protection work that others are doing. We work in partnership.
More questions for Martin? Just to have the opportunity for questions for the other speakers that we didn't get to. So I know Valerie had a question for Colm. I don't know if you want to ask that now, Valerie, or... Yeah, so we've got extra time, so we can ask. I'll bring the mic.
Maybe to both of you, but we had talked yesterday about deaths while at sea, and I wanted to understand, because we're talking about this spectrum, right? I think we were talking about exploitation and then human trafficking on this end, but deaths at sea, right? Either by neglect or by basically fishers not being able to rectify whatever conditions they're dealing with, for example, malnutrition or water systems that are not clean. I mean, talking to Rosen of ITF, he had educated me about the fact that basically some of these vessels' water systems need to be serviced every few months, otherwise bacteria and other things kind of like accumulate. So the fact that water systems are source of illnesses that then workers don't have medical care, but if they could, they would be asking for support for that to be rectified early in a trip. The fact that they may be asking for that, they may be asking for that to be rectified, but nothing happens, nothing gets fixed, and then somebody ends up dead. I mean, to me, part of the conversation about forced labor is to understand that some of these conditions must have been already asked to be fixed during that trip, but nothing happened. And if those people would have had the chance to disembark, because the food is not adequate, because illnesses are happening, because people have infections, because people have swollen feet from beriberi or whatever it may be, that at some point the neglect of this particular vessel management, then what is the threshold of that? Because to me, part of the discussion about criminal neglect, right? Like anywhere else in the Western world, I would say that if I get ill from my job, but then I have recourse. But here, we don't have recourse because people cannot actually discuss this outside. And furthermore, there is really very long trips where the problem then is somebody already has died or has been hurt, right, by an accident or whatever it is. So I'm just, from a perspective of law enforcement and criminal activity, let's say, I mean, how do you understand that? And that goes back to the issue that Michael was talking about, which is the issue of deception, right? If I'm being told I'm gonna be fed and I'm gonna have water and I'm gonna have what I need to survive, and that is not actually being given, and my life depends on this, then what are then, how can the threshold of me showing that food should have been given to me, and the fact that I ended up not having that food, in my view, it's like, what kind of threshold are we talking about? Because those are cases, we know of a lot of cases of fishers dying of preventable illnesses, malnutrition, water issues. So that's a question for me. Yeah, thanks.
From the criminal side, yeah, it gets quite difficult, but not impossible. So I don't have any awareness of anything from the fishery side, but the scenario you're describing, there are prosecutions we're in the middle of. One which some people from maybe the UK are familiar with was a petrol station, a service station in the north of Ireland, in the North County of Ireland, where certain works should have been done, weren't done, repairs weren't done, and the petrol station blew up and killed a number of people. So the people who were responsible for doing that works are now being investigated and prosecuted for those acts. So in criminal law it's possible, but you need to show that there was a deliberate act, or that there was negligence. And you need to show that, as I said in my presentation, beyond reasonable doubt. And you have to be able to put that before the DPP to prosecute. So while not impossible, I would say extremely difficult. But coming back to the point that was made earlier, if there are fishers on board vessels who have proper communications and who are able to identify and log issues and try and get them rectified, and then those aren't actioned and that results in something else happening, that's evidence. You know, so that's critical. And then I'm a great believer from a law enforcement perspective of let's gather what we can gather and let the prosecutors decide is there enough there. And if there isn't enough there, tell us what's not there so that we can go back and try again, or in this case we can try again. I think that's the only model from a law enforcement perspective that I've seen succeed.
If I can do your case really on a slightly different approach. I mean, Colm obviously dealt with the policing and the criminal justice, but at the moment, and this is why the part of the plan is about international organisations and what they do. So the World Health Organization gathers data from primary and secondary care across the world, and that's how they decide what the priorities are, and that's how they then say, oh, there needs to be an action plan, or there needs to be a focus on X, Y, Z. You know, there'll be some really strange things that they record, as in, you know, and when I say strange, I mean, there'll be violent crime that's recorded, and then it will say hammer used, gun used, knife used, you know, domestic related, and all that data is collated, and then it feeds into international and national and policy, and then will, you know, actually then start to inform governments and industries and highlight where the risk is. And when you look at now, you know, in our part of the world, you know, the health and safety on construction sites is like way ahead where it was, and that was because of the amount of deaths that there were. And at the moment, for human trafficking, and I don't know what it's like with the fisheries and so on and so forth, but I know with human trafficking, if somebody went into a hospital in Dublin or London or Paris, there is no requirement, or there's no process for the primary and secondary medical care to actually put a tick in the box, this was trafficking and this is... So this is kind of lost on international data that feeds into strategic planning and funding and processing. So that's why there is a push for us outside of the police, because the police obviously are doing their job, and this is what we want to do, is to try and, you know, so that more funding will go, more intelligence will go, more knowledge will be there, and then policies coming in to hold the businesses to account, and the captains, the owners, and so on and so forth.
Just an observation from me in response to the really important points you raised is how important it is to ensure that those on the front line, people that we strive to support in RISE, Stella Maris chaplains, are appropriately trained so they know how to respond, how to ameliorate the situation rather than exacerbate the situation, working with their local ITF inspector, for example, knowing what is the ITF's responsibility, knowing when to step back and let the ITF take charge, knowing, you know, Port Health, knowing what their responsibility is. You know, first responders, which chaplains and pastoral workers so often are, need to have ongoing training to ensure that their response is as effective as possible.
We have 2 more questions.
I'm sorry, I go again. I think we have a good suggestion for fundraising our gentleman from Hyland, you show 3 faces there. It's $5 million each, am I right? So we will find the 3 of them, and we have $15 million for the work with fishes, am I right? Okay, so that's number 1. That is not a nice joke. Question is this: human trafficking is extremely well organized, and thanks for all the ideas you guys gave. How about artificial intelligence in this business? We haven't heard anything so far. What is your take? Artificial intelligence and human trafficking. They are always ahead of us. Always. Any comment?
Yeah, it's a fair point. They're always ahead of us. For a while, we catch up. We do catch up. So part of my responsibility, you will have seen, I have a responsibility for sexual crime in Ireland as well, how that's investigated. And we use artificial intelligence to target child sexual abusers now, currently. And just as you mentioned it, I think that model is certainly something we could apply. So what we're doing is looking at the online world and the dark web and the clear web, and looking covertly at how child sex abusers are organising, how they're arranging, how they're sharing material, how they're sharing data. So the very same model could certainly be applied to human trafficking. The key, I suppose, is, from my perspective, again from a law enforcement perspective, is to identify those people and to try and get in behind their activities. So I totally agree, it's a good suggestion.
And Paolo, I think we'll have a presentation on this later, covering AI, as it were, in supply chains. AI is just a way of creating and assessing so much data that it will take an office of 1,000 people to do it. It can do it quickly, and then it can predict. And for example, we've heard so many things about, particularly in the fishing industry, turning off the trackers, turning off, no Wi-Fi, repeated injuries, this, that, and that. If that was all data, built in as part of a supply chain transparency process, that you had to do this amount, then AI could then start to predict and actually identify the rogue candidates. Not from a police perspective, although some of it would end up there, but a lot of it would be about, you can no longer now trade in that country because their laws. You can no longer trade in the EU because of X, Y, Z. You can't trade in Australia. And, over a number of years, this is going to become a little bit more of the norm, I think. But we're at baby steps at the moment.
So we've got 2 more questions. I think the next one is in Mandarin though, so we need, do we have a spare headset?
我想提的是有关于被害人的赔偿的问题。国内的，我们台湾的这个人口贩运防治法是有一笔，就是被害人的赔偿金，就是会从他的犯罪所得没入这笔金钱，然后来赔偿给被害人。可是这个前提必须他是被害人。那刚刚有提到，就是说，如果是证据不足的话，但是其实他还是被害了，只是因为证据不足的关系，所以不一定能够得到赔偿。那你刚刚提到说，如果没有办法提到足够的证据，还有另外一个方法，就是用刑事求偿的方式。但是这样子的方式呢，如果在台湾执行的话，如果是民事求偿的话，必须要有一个裁判费。所以那个裁判费是不是会由这个被害人来支付，或者是你有其他的管道或是制度可以来协助这些被害人取得这样的赔偿？谢谢。
So, you can talk about it from European perspective and some other perspectives, in as much as international how compensation can be obtained. But there is an EU directive that's been around for some time, and all states within the EU have a compensation scheme, which has to be funded by the state. And it's about the victim being able to be compensated, even when there's no funds from the criminal. So, assaults and all those things. It's been pretty slow to use in trafficking, and some of the countries I've inspected and worked with in the Council of Europe have made no compensation awards at all on trafficking. Whereas others, and it's one thing that the UK has been quite strong on with compensation and its criminal injuries compensation authority, there are very large sums of money for people who suffer trauma, including in trafficking. And in its legislation and around criminal injuries compensation, it specifies human trafficking is one of the crimes. That panel, at most places, they have judges sit on it, and really it's a process that doesn't cost the victim, certainly in the UK, but there are other jurisdictions where there may be a process where they get legal support, but it's quite difficult for them to go to. Under the UN Colm Protocol, EU Directive, Council of Europe Convention, and the others, it all talks about compensation because it's not a handout, this is about reparation and being able to get somebody back on their feet. And in some areas, it's compensation which can cover all your losses, including, not just the losses you've had from your finances, but you personally. Whereas some, it has to be a loss that you've endured. So it's a lot of work on this issue. It's one that the Council of Europe, when they do their evaluations of country, continually criticise because when there's no money available from the trafficker, it then has to come from the state. There's not big budgets for that in many countries, where they limit the levels to quite low, and therefore, sometimes it's almost not worth even applying for. But it's something that, from the Council of Europe and the UN, they keep on talking about better compensation because that means somebody can get back on their own 2 feet.
Yeah, similarly to what Kevin has described, everything that we seize in Ireland, assets, finances, is fed back into what's called the central exchequer, so into the government fund, and then victims are entitled to apply to the criminal injuries compensation scheme to get payment back from that. And I think critically that costs nothing. It costs nothing to the victim. And another part, I suppose, from the law enforcement perspective, when we're prosecuting and we are supporting victims through the criminal justice process, obviously the state finances everything that's needed there. There's no cost to the victim in that process.
Hello. I think we have one more question.
Thank you for allowing me to have a question, and also thank for very nice presentation. I have a question, but before that I want to express about the case identification. I know every country have a very strong intention to the human trafficking, and we also know that the human trafficking is a people organized crime, and some case is involved from the high rank of the power people in the country, and so some case we need to very carefully on investigation and identification the case. So my question, I want to ask, how do you ensure the investigation and case identification is very fair for the suspected victim, and to avoid the victim become a double or triple victim, and how you ensure the identification is really without pressure and fair for the victim based on the internal law or on the Palermo Protocol or something like that. So I want to know how to ensure the identification is fairly for the suspected victim. Thank you.
Yeah, again, I think a lot of it comes back to the training and awareness and the skills of our investigators. So I think if one of those people were here with me today, they'd tell you that 90% of their time is taken up in supporting the victim, meeting the victim, taking multiple steps to the victim, and helping them to go through the process. Because we know the process, clearly a victim isn't going to know the process. I think the insurance bit about how are we doing that properly, rests with us as a police organisation. But we are subject to external scrutiny. We are subject to oversight by external bodies to make sure we're doing the work that we're supposed to be doing. And we're also, Kevin mentioned in his presentation, the TIPS report that is coordinated through the United States. And we report as part of that as well, which, I suppose, while not an oversight, it's certainly an accountability forum for trafficking in persons. I think we have, to hang our hat and to put really our faith in our investigators. They're constantly being trained, they're constantly being upskilled, they're constantly working with the support groups, with the NGOs, with the relevant trade organisations to make sure we are able to do our job. And a key part of our job is how we support victims. I think it's our bread and butter. While it may not make sense to really, our logo in Garda Síochána and the Irish Police is keeping people safe. So it's at the core of everything that we do.
Okay, great, thanks. Do we have any more questions?
Sorry to keep you from from our lunch, but my name is Jorge Digno. I'm from the Philippines. What I have to say, I have a comment and a question. And my comment, I must apologize if you think that this thing that I have to say is rather unpopular, but when it comes to the Palermo protocols, I think we have to understand it as not as human rights protocols, but as anti-crime protocols. And what that means is that human trafficking becomes a law enforcement issue rather than a question of moral outcry. And there will always be a gap between practice and paper because we're dealing with a phenomenon really that has more resources than any government, any particular government. So no matter how much resources you pour into this effort, you're never going to see any much success. Rather, in fact, if we look at what human trafficking has become over the last 2 decades, it's worse than it was from 2 decades ago. And what we need to do here is taking off from the talk of Father Peter, is that we need to build a high and sustained degree of revulsion against trafficking without stigmatizing or hurting the victims. And so I wonder whether law enforcement agencies are able to connect with groups like Arise to sort of root out, the cause of or causes of slavery and trafficking, and also to imbue it with a sense of moral outrage against the problem of trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think in terms of what you've raised there about collaboration between Arise and law enforcement, I didn't share this with you, but Kevin is the chair of the board of Arise, and so we're deepening our collaboration with Kevin and his network in law enforcement, the Santa Marta Group, and others. And on your point regarding language, I think language is critical, obviously. And it's something I've learned that often we can lapse into talking about the challenge of human trafficking. It's a crime. We can sort of use relatively neutral language. And also, I say this as someone that works in the UK, that the anti-trafficking movement can be seen as a relatively fashionable cause to be associated with. And then we sort of wrap ourselves in a comfort blanket thinking, well, I'm a good person because I'm involved in this particular cause. But actually, as you've explained, as I mentioned, there's more trafficking, more slavery than ever. So there's no time, no room for complacency.
Yeah, agreed, Martin. I can only speak from Garda Síochána in Ireland as what we do. Certainly, we're one of the partners with Santa Marta as a law enforcement agency. We're not alone. There are other police forces who are with Santa Marta that Kevin can speak about. But on a day-to-day basis, we're working with NGOs. And this isn't a case of, and one practical example, every time my team go to conduct what we call a welfare check on somewhere where we suspect victims of sexual exploitation are working out of, we're accompanied with an NGO, with a charity who goes with us so that we cross over that boundary. And if that person isn't comfortable to speak to law enforcement, they can speak to the person, so to the NGO representative. And there's language issues that obviously arise. They help us with that as well. So it's not that we can build it, it's part of our day-to-day work in Ireland.
And I think what you say about human rights versus criminal justice is absolutely right. But actually the Palermo Protocol, when you read it, a lot of it is about, or most of it is about providing support, providing measures. But it does then talk about prevention and holding accountability, as does the Council of Europe and all the other things I spoke about. What's not happened is these have never been resourced properly. And that's why we're seeing it's easy for people to do it. And there's no sanction. And if you're even in a big business, a multilateral business that's billions in revenue, you don't worry about it because nothing will happen. But I'll give you a good example of where this comes from and where Santa Marta Group came from. Was working with the religious sisters, NHS, NGOs, and other partners coming up to the 2012 Olympics in London. And I was leading the trafficking prevention and trafficking responses for the Olympics. And we set up a centre which was going to have this process where we were going to, particularly sexual exploitation, we were worried about an increase in the trafficking. So we did a plan across all of us, and also about trafficking in the building to the games, so 2 or 3 years before that, and then during the games, forced labour for selling, counterfeit goods and all that. And we had a plan, and we all worked to that. One thing we saw during the Olympics, as opposed to any other games that you see around, was a decline. Because all the partners were working together, we all know what we were doing. It was a 24/7 basis. And every night I would go and I would meet with all the teams that were out there, including religious sisters, and we would get feedback and we would all understand that. Now those bases, those grounding, those roots are still there. And they carry on day in, day out. There will be police officers working with religious sisters in West London today, or in East London, or with organised charities. There are police officers embedded into charities that are doing on trafficking in the UK, because we did take a human rights approach. And I know, I'm talking to you from a different jurisdiction, but in our jurisdictions, say for example, a police officer is involved in something where somebody is hurt, or somebody is shot, which is very, very rare in our jurisdictions, very rare, that is immediately investigated. If a police officer is involved in a crash, so the accountability to police, and they're looked upon to see were they considering the human rights of the other person. And that has changed the culture of policing. Sometimes it's very difficult for police to work within those models, but it's a requirement. And so when you say human rights in the Palermo Protocol, it's about the way you implement it. It's not the protocol itself, it's about the way you implement it and how much resource you put to it.
Sorry, we've had conscious about 15 additional minutes in Q&A. I'm glad we did, because it's important questions. I just want to wrap up from, my perspective, by no means a human trafficking expert, but my takeaways. What it seems like to me is acting with impunity is a huge barrier. There are laws in place, there are processes to enforce those laws, but then there's an inefficiency, within that, and it allows companies or organised crime to exploit those loopholes. I think, in the context of fishing, that's a really key lesson to learn, because at the moment, I think as explained earlier, we're inundated with cases. We're actually mostly at the moment we lack those systems to process the cases. So I think a proactive approach and taking this topic, and the points made in this, from the speakers that during this time is really important to make sure you get ahead of that. For when we get to the place of opening fisheries, where people can go to the police or they can go to the right services and get a remedy for justice. And with the North Star, of course, being prevention, and that these people don't end up in these situations in the first place. So yeah, hopefully that's my takeaway. And so thank you to the speakers. And also